good morning, or good afternoon, or maybe it's evening, or maybe you're watching this in the middle of the night. I really have no idea. That's the beauty of this crazy remote world we live in, right? But I'm Ben Freeman, and it's an absolute pleasure to meet you for the first time. I imagine this is the first time you're seeing my face. Don't worry, you'll get to see it some more over the next 24 hours or so. And I'm also not sure what Bill Buzzy has told you about me or any of my esteemed colleagues have said. They love to crack jokes about the defense budget. And after all, can you blame them? Al's up there. He's telling you about superheroes, Disney, Pirates of the Caribbean, nanotechnology, man. He's got all the cool gadgets. Then Steve's there, he's got a freaking breeder game for crying out loud. How am I supposed to keep up with that stuff? Um, but the thing about it is, I know you were probably sitting there looking at that schedule of yours, and you were saying, you know what, that stuff's pretty cool and everything, but I really want to hear about the defense budget, right? Huh? Who doesn't like a good defense budget talk on a Friday afternoon, huh? All right. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I get a little excited about this, and I'll confess, if I did have to pick my title, it would be IDB's resident defense budget nerd. And I'm make no two bones about it. I love numbers. I always have. And when you're working in the national security space, what better numbers are there than that old defense budget? And whether we like it or not, the defense budget, it is life. It's the life of our programs. It can be the life of our employees. It can be, even our own personal welfare too. So the defense budget process, it really determines where DoD is going and where it's at now. And it can really affect your livelihoods and a lot of those for the folks that you're working with and for. So it's incredibly important to understand what's happening with the defense budget, how that process works, and I think particularly where we're at in that process. And what I just laid out there is actually the roadmap of what we're going to be going over together in the next day or so between the async content, which we're starting with here, and the sync content, which we're going to be able to do, which we can have some good back and forth. Hopefully during that process, I'll be able to get out my crystal ball a little bit for you and sort of predict what we see in the defense budget going forward this year and maybe into the next few years as well to give you guys kind of a heads up on what's going on. Sound like a good plan? All right. Well, what we're going to do in this section here, I'm going to share my screen real quick, is we're going to talk about the first part of this process, which I affectionately like to refer to as defense budgeting in theory. And what this really is, this is how the process is supposed to work. If you have any friends that have ever, worked on the Hill, worked in Congress, or you might have heard this in a class or two, we refer to this process as regular order. When everything works on time and we get that defense budget process done before the fiscal year is over, before the next one starts, so that budget for the new year is rocking and ready to go. This section here, we're going to talk about exactly how that process should work. And when we're talking about this process, we're really talking about sort of three basic players. And you can see them on the screen here. We got the White House, we got the Pentagon, and we got Congress. And the way this works in theory, again, or at least in the public's eyes, it looks a little bit like this. And this process, according to the public, begins with the State of the Union. This is the first time the public really gets any sort of sense about what budget priorities might be like in the coming years. Is in the President's State of the Union, are they focusing very heavily on national security? Are they focusing more on domestic priorities? Is healthcare a big issue? Presidents really tip their hand in those State of the Unions and give folks an indication of where they're going to want to invest the government's money in the coming year. Those typically happen, the State of the Unions happen in January of a given year. Shortly after that, the president will submit their budget to Congress very shortly after that. And this is where they have all the details, sort of where the president puts their money where their mouth was in that State of the Union. In that president's budget, one of the keys I want to make about this, and I want y'all to take home, And we're going to play a lot of myth busters throughout the course of our talks here on the async content and with the sync content. And we're going to start right here. One of the myths that I often hear is people talking about the president's budget as if it's clad in stone, as if like, well, the president requested it, that's what we're going to get. As a lot of you who work in budgetary rules or even just on the receiving end of some of these know, that's just not true in many cases. And one of the big reasons, I think one of the words folks leave out right here at this point in the process is that the president's budget is just a request. And you will often hear folks talk about this as the budget request or the administration's budget request. And there's a good reason for that, because then when the president submits that budget to Congress, Congress does not whatsoever have to abide by that budget. And in many cases with DoD, particularly the DoD budget, Congress very often says, yeah, that budget's a non-starter. We're not going to do that. It can just basically shred it up right off the bat and begin their own process of creating the budget. Because at the end of the day, Congress, as we all probably remember from our intro to American government classes, Congress has the power of the purse. They're the ones who actually say, here's exactly how much money all these different programs are going to get. Here's how it's going to be spread around. And Congress really controls that power. And if you look through the rest of this diagram, you sort of get a sense about how that process works. The way I like to explain this is we're going down two tracks within two chambers. And so right off the bat, we're splitting this. The process sort of splits up. The president's budget goes to both the House and the Senate, goes to those budget committees, get a budget resolution. And then from there, in both chambers, we get this split between the Armed Services Committees and the Appropriations Committees. We're going to talk more about those in a little bit. But effectively, a good way to think about these, the Armed Services Committees are also known as the authorizing committees. These are the folks who authorize spending. When we say authorization committee, we're talking about authorizing spending. They can authorize spending for new programs. They can authorize increases in spending for different programs for quantities. Whereas the appropriators are the ones who are actually providing us with the dollars and cents. How much exact money is a specific program going to get? Are they going to get more than last year, less than last year? What are those exact dollar amounts? And so from there, slightly different process with the rules committees in the House. But then once those Armed Services Committees and the Appropriations Committees, once they figure that process out, they work it out of committee, and then they do what's called a markup phase, where those committees are basically hashing out what's going to be in those bills within the committees themselves. Then once they figure that out, then it goes to the floor. And then you have a floor debate. And during that floor debate, you don't have to be a member of those committees to sort of chime in on what you think about those bills. Any member of each respective chamber can chime in there and provide their thoughts. And then you sort of hash it out. You sort of hash it out that way on the floor. A key part happens right here, which is really important. You might have heard of these conference committees on the NDAA. What a conference committee means is just simply that this is where they're trying to work out their differences between the two sides. So you always have to go to a conference committee unless these bills are perfectly identical, which is incredibly challenging because the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, every year it's over 1,000 pages, sometimes over 2,000 pages. These are really, really massive bills. And so in order to not have a conference committee, you'd have to have the exact same bill, right off the bat or right out of these floor debates. It almost never happens. And so what you have to do then, you have these conference committees, which is effectively you get representatives of both the House and the Senate, and you get both Democratic and Republican representatives, typically the higher ranking folks. So you'll get the heads of the Armed Services Committees and other high ranking officials in both parties too. So they come together and they're working behind closed doors to get this process done. And then, and this is a key too, the conference committee happens behind closed doors, but everything else I've talked about here so far, it's largely public. There's congressional hearings about a lot of this stuff. You can watch this on C-SPAN. We're going to watch a hearing here in a little bit. And so the public can really see what's going on here. Conference committees, on the other hand, is behind the scenes, and so this is where a lot of the good or bad, depending on your perspective, horse trading happens, because it's a lot less accountable to the public. And then we go through the same process here with defense appropriations. And then after those conference committees, basically the conference committee comes up with this sort of unified bill. That bill then has to go back to both the House and the Senate. And each chamber has to give it that thumbs up majority vote. And then once they do, it goes down to the president. And this is Barack Obama, so it's a little bit of an older chart. But nowadays it would go to President Donald Trump. Who can veto or veto that or go ahead and give it the thumbs up there, right? Pretty easy. What I'm wondering about all of you right now is who out there has participated in a budget process at DoD. Now, go ahead and raise your hands. Well, anybody done anything with the POM, Program Objective Memorandum? I'm sure. I'm sure once we talk in person, a bunch of you have worked on these things. And what you're probably going is like, hey, this stuff happens, way before this budget request. And you're exactly right, because this is what the public sees. What the public doesn't see is what's happening at the DoD. In the budget process within the Pentagon looks very different than what it does to the public. This is the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process, also known as PPB&E. And if you look at this chart, there's 3 columns here that sort of explain what happens. And really, you'll notice here that it takes till you get to the 3rd column before you even see that part that the public was seeing with the president's budget and all this stuff here. Where this really starts with DoD, it starts where I think we would hope the budget process would start, with strategy, with our planning, working with the Joint Chiefs and their strategic planning guidance, those SPGs, working with the COCOMs, getting the military department's input, and you sort of working it down here. Some of those POMs, those Program Objective Memorandums, I bet some of you folks have worked on. You start to get input from those here. And then you start to get this good back and forth with individual services about what's going on here. And then right here, you get to what I think is an important part of the process. And this is where the Office of the Secretary of Defense starts to review these POMs and issues these PDMs, these Program Decision Memorandums. And this is the part between this and this part right here with an organization called OMB. That stands for the Office of Management and Budget, which is actually a fancy way of saying these are the president's defense budget nerds. The key thing about the Office of the Secretary of Defense and OMB is that these are filled with political appointees. By design, the Secretary of Defense, it's somebody that's appointed by the president. Typically, somebody kind of sees the world pretty eye to eye with the president. In the Office of Management and Budget, similar case there. The head of OMB is appointed by the president, and a lot of the folks who work there are political appointees too. And I bring this all up as a way to say this, if any, and this is another myth we're going to bust, and this is the myth that the defense budget is not a political document. I assure you that it is, and it actually is by design. In that process starts right here with the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Office of Management and Budget. This is really the first time in the process that we can sort of deviate, and we start to deviate from this planning process that we see over here, coming down from the Joint Chiefs and getting that input from the programs. This is where the process can, so it doesn't have to, but it can start to get away from those more strategic needs that we see in DoD. And so once OMB starts reviewing this, then they do sort of this back and forth with the Office of Secretary of Defense and some work with the individual services there. And then the services prepare the president's budget, and it reflects all that input from the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Office of Management and Budget, impact of the PDBs, all that good stuff is now rolled into one. And then all of that right there, then that becomes the president's budget right there. So the public, thinking about this process, the public doesn't see any of this. None of this here on these left 2 columns, none of this is public. So everything that the public sees is over here. But for you guys, this right column, this is actually the exciting part. And particularly this phase here we call apportionment, which is a fancy way of saying you get your money. We we get those bills passed, the authorizations, the appropriations are passed in Congress. Ultimately, that money, the apportionment, the allocation phase, that ultimately means money coming into your hand. And so thinking about that process, apologies for the phone ringing. That's the world we live in, right? Remote land. So thinking about this process, if we take a step back, what happens when DoD gets to that point with the services is that we're doing this back and forth with the White House here, and when the White House ultimately says, okay, everything looks good, and that's the OMB guys have said, everything is fine here. That process, then the president will deliver that State of the Union, prepare that budget, and send that budget over to Congress. Now, Congress here, this is our lovely Congress. Everybody loves Congress these days, right? Uh, you're probably thinking I love Congress about as much as I love budgets, right? But Congress is where a lot of this magic happens here. And this view, I like to tell people, this view here is sort of looking at Congress from the west to the east. And in case folks don't know, the Senate is sort of on the left side, on the north side of the building. Their buildings are over there, and the House is on the right. And I would normally, if we were in person, I would ask you, anybody know why? And people have a lot of conjectures and everything. The simple fact of the matter is that the Senate's actually closer to the train station. And so historically, the Senate could get out of town just a little bit quicker than the House could. Sounds like the Congress of today, right? Well, when we're thinking about this process, it's actually good. I like this picture because it's good to think about this process going down these two paths. If we think about this, this kind of left side of the screen going down that Senate path, and we're going down the right side, which is that House path. And then within those two paths too, we're going down two basic processes. The Appropriations Committee process happens both in the House and the Senate. And remember, the appropriators, they're the ones who are deciding exactly how much money each program gets. And then we have the Armed Services Committees, both the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, formerly headed by Senator John McCain. And I think another way to think about these two, in a way that's always helped me, is to think about when I was a kid growing up, and I'd want to go to the movies. Typically, what would happen is I would go to my dad and I would say, hey Dad, I want to go to the movies. Can I have $20? And my dad, of course, he knew he was raising a future budget nerd, and he said, son, I'm not on the Appropriations Committee, right? I'm not giving you any money. And I was like, oh God. And I was like, okay, Dad, do I have authorization to go? He was like, yes, that's what I can do as the authorizer. So I go, okay. So I run over to Mom then. Mom always had the money. And I go over to Mom and I was like, hey, Mom, can I have $20 to go to the movies? And Mom also knew she was raising a rising budget nerd. And she says, has this trip been authorized by your father? And I was like, oh, yeah, yes, it has. We have full authorization for this visit. And she was like, okay, now how much money do you want? So $20. And she hands me $10 and tells me to get out of there. Which in a nutshell is the way a lot of appropriators treat a lot of programs, including at DoD. And that's an oversimplification, but the really interesting thing about this process is that a lot of this, as I mentioned, it's televised, it's on TV. You can actually watch multiple different parts of the defense budget process. And they have what they call posture hearings, which is effectively a fancy way of saying, okay, Congress says, okay, we've got your budget. Now we want to understand more why this is your posture. Why is this the defense posture? Why does the Army need X amount of money for this? Why the heck does the Air Force keep asking for more money for those stinking F-35s? And this is Congress's opportunity to exercise oversight, to say, okay, this is what you've requested. We want you to come in and we want you to tell us all about it. And frankly, between you and I, it's a whole lot of theater. I was privy to testify before a Senate Armed Services subcommittee one time. And so I can tell you all about that process, and maybe I will. But a lot of it is theater. But occasionally it isn't. And I want to show you one important video where it most certainly was not. Man, I'll tell you guys when I was watching that live when that first went down, and it was like me and like five other defense budget nerds on Twitter, and we were all just like, "Oh man, Odierno slam! You saw you saw how he worked him over." We it was the most exciting thing, and the reason we got like such a hoot out of it is because man, vast majority of the time when you're watching a budget hearing or you know anything about these posture hearings, they're usually incredibly boring. Moments like that are incredibly rare. So I wanted to point that out for y'all, and would love to hear once we're in the sync class together. Would love to hear other stories about folks you know preparing folks for hearings or that sort of thing. And I'll follow up too a couple interesting follow-ups on the people in that video. So the congressman there who was providing the questioning, his name is Duncan Hunter, and he's a congressman out of San Diego. And that name might ring a bell because in the past few years, he has been indicted on some campaign finance charges, doing a lot of illegal, allegedly doing a lot of illegal stuff with his campaign funds, including spending the money on the mistresses, family travel, all sorts of crazy stuff. But my favorite little snippet, as I was, reading through all the stuff he did, was that amongst many other things, he paid for travel for the family bunny using company funds. I don't know if there's any bunny lovers out there, but this is the first instance I'm aware of a congressman illegally using funds to fly their bunny. Another thing about that video too is the chairman of that committee is a guy named Howard Buck McKeon. He left Congress a couple years ago, and I'll give you just one guess on what he's doing now, and I'll give you a hint. It's the probably one of the most common professions for former members of Congress right now. Give you some. You guessed it. He's a lobbyist. He was the former chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and so he oversaw a lot of work for major defense contractors. And now many of those defense contractors are his clients for his firm, the McKeon Group. But in addition to that, he really makes my radar because I focus a lot in my day job on tracking the work that foreign governments are doing to try and influence U.S. foreign policy. And Buck McKeon, he works for the government of Saudi Arabia, which, amongst many other things, is a recipient of a lot of U.S. military hardware, equipment, and other training too. And so he can double dip in some cases, working for some of his clients who are selling these weapons, and then he's also working for the buyer in Saudi Arabia. So nice double dip there. I also mentioned too that I would sort of spill the beans about my experience testifying. And God, it was almost 10 years ago now. I was relatively new to DC, and I had done this report on the force structure in the military. And the organization I was working at, they had done some work on something they called brass creep, which is effectively having folks of higher and higher rank doing stuff that lower ranking folks used to do, which is of course more cost effective or more costly, and it can be inefficient too. And so, I'd started there a few months before, and they said, "All right, you're a numbers nerd. We want you to update this report. It's been a bunch of years since we've done it. So, we'd like to get that update of it." So I dove into it, and sort of quickly realized it came to kind of the startling conclusion to me that the U.S. military was more top heavy than it had ever been. Both in terms of our general and flag officer ratio to the rest of the officers, and enlisted to officers too. Pretty much regardless of the metric you chose, we were more top heavy than we had ever been. And I look back to the founding of the military, so I had over 200 years of data to sort through, which, as you can imagine, for a data nerd, it was like a data nerd's dream. So I created a bazillion charts and everything. And of course, my boss is like, "You sure?" And I was like, of course, like, "Here's 30 charts, showing you exactly what's going on." Coincidentally, at the same time, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the subcommittee on personnel, announced they were having a hearing on, you guessed it, generals and flag officers in the military, and sort of this exact same topic of, do we have too many generals and flag officers? And so my boss was like, "Oh, look at this announcement. We should share your research with them." And so we did. I was coming out of academia, so I was like, the idea that anybody would read my research, I'm used to just having 5 people at a conference sitting in the crowd, and maybe or maybe not applauding. So the idea that it could be of use to some Senate committee was very exciting to me. So we just gave them the research, and they called us in, and they said, "We'd like you to brief us on it. Tell us more." And so we told them more, and gave them all the details and everything. I'll never forget this to this day. This kind of grizzled Navy veteran. He was heading up the staff group that we were talking to, and he was like, "Dr. Freeman, can I be frank with you?" So, "Please, sir, do. I'd love to get any feedback you have, sir." And he says, "Your analysis stinks." And I mean, I'm telling you, for a data nerd, guys, He might as well have said my mama was ugly. I was just beside myself. And I'm like, sir, no, I assure you that all my numbers are correct. I was like, I even got backup pie charts here. You want to see another line chart? I got even more. Let me show you all my charts. And he's like, no, no, no. I know in his head he's probably like, all right, shut up, you big geek. That's not what I'm talking about. What he said was, he was like, your numbers are fine. It's what you say after that. It's like, it's not your place to tell the military what they should do about this issue. Like, you're a civilian, stay out of it. And so I was like, oh, okay. I don't know. I worked at an organization where literally our motto was exposing corruption, exploring solutions. And I was like, sort of, I got to explore some solutions at least. Um, but he made it very clear that both that they did want me to testify at this hearing, and that I was not welcome to testify if I was going to provide, my 2 cents about how this problem should be answered, and that will leave that to military folks. Um, and so, in other words, I would have to compromise my report. And I very quickly said, "Yeah, let's do it." Happy to get the information out there just to testify with it. Even my boss, a little more pure than I was, said, no, we're not going to compromise the report. And I just told him, I was like, we'll just write our own report later and, publish it separately, which we did. Needless to say, we go in. They knew what I was going to say. They already knew what my numbers said when I testified. And I did get some good questions from Lindsey Graham and Kelly Ayotte and Mitch Webb, or I'm sorry, Jim Webb. Was chairing the subcommittee at the time, and he total tangent, but Jim Webb, former Marine, has just this like vice grip of a handshake, which was a real contrast to me, because I then immediately after that I shook Lindsey Graham's hand, and this is not to get into politics or anything, but it was one of the like sort of came at me with this like kind of almost dead fish of a hand, and I didn't know, as there was like, do I kiss the ring? I really didn't know what to do, and so ultimately I went in and just said, tried to grab it there, a tale of two handshakes, if you will. But at the hearing, Lindsey Graham asked some good questions. So did some of the other folks there. But ultimately, they had the service chiefs go on right after me, and they said, well, got this information from Dr. Freeman that says we're more top heavy than we've ever been. What do you have to say about it? It was the vice chiefs of all the services, and to a person, they said effectively, well, we have the exact force structure that we need to defend the nation. We have the exact force structure we need to defend the nation. So then it became all the news stories about the hearing. It's like, there you have it. Most top heavy force in U.S. history is the exact force we need to defend the nation. And that was it. But it was a good lesson for me in that, these sort of behind the scenes look at these hearings, and that they very much can be political theater until they're not. But regardless of that, when we're going through this process, this posture review process, and then we go to the congressional markups, we work this back and forth. Once they sort that out, then we go back to, once they get all that worked out, and they agree, they've gone through those conference committees, agreed on the bills, goes back to the president for that signature. And the defense budget is usually I should say, it's pretty bipartisan, passes almost every year. Very, 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 very rarely in U.S. history is there a veto of this bill. So the president will almost always give it that thumbs up. Then that money kicks back over to the Pentagon, and that's when we get into this side of the process right here. That's when we start to get into, once they pass, president signs the bills, get into apportionment, and then the money starts flowing and ultimately makes its way to you guys and your programs, and everybody's happy, of course, right? So where are we at right now? And this is going to become important. I'm glad we're going to end this async part on this slide right here. And this is the president's budget request for FY 2021. We are right now in the absolute heart of the NDAA process and the defense appropriations process. So all these are going on. There's a lot of different numbers flying around, but I just wanted to give you guys a sense of where we started with DoD. So with DoD, we're looking at a $705 billion budget. 636 billion of that is in the base. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term of OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operations Account, This is also known as the war budget. So that's why when we say, there's this 636 billion in the base, that's what we're, before we had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this was the defense budget. Since we've had those wars, we have this other OCO account. Some call it a slush fund, but these two together, make up the entire budget. And the way it breaks out here is, the Army gets about 150, Navy 194, Air Force 185, defense wide 106. Remember all those numbers because they are going to be very important when we do our sync session and talk a lot more about this. But that's all we're going to cover for now. It has been a pleasure talking with you so far, and I very much look forward to the sync session and learning more. Oh, but don't forget also to tune in to my always uplifting debt and deficits conversation, where we are going to dig into all those great issues and sort of get a sense of what this year has done for the DoD and what pressures debt and deficits are going to put on it. So look for that in the async content too. And then when we get to the sync, I got about an hour and 15 minutes of your time. It should be a rocking and rolling good time. Can't wait to see you guys. So have a wonderful day. Bye.